He thought denying her would be harmless, a quiet dismissal no one would remember, but within minutes, that single decision would echo far beyond the walls of that grand hall and into a silence he would never forget. The theater stood like a monument to prestige, its towering columns lit by warm golden lights, casting long reflections across polished marble floors that echoed softly beneath every measured step. Guests in tailored suits and elegant gowns filled the lobby, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation as they awaited an evening promised to celebrate the finest pianists in the country. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light like fragments of applause yet to come. And then, almost unnoticed at first, she stepped inside. Sister Margaret Hayes moved quietly through the entrance, her modest gray habit contrasting sharply against the opulence surrounding her. At nearly 70 years old, her posture remained steady, her hands folded gently in front of her as if she carried no urgency, no need to belong to the spectacle unfolding around her. A few heads turned, not in recognition, but in confusion. She did not fit the room. Not here. Not among donors who spoke in hushed tones about investments and influence. Not among performers who carried the polished confidence of years on prestigious stages. She walked with calm purpose, her soft shoes barely making a sound against the marble, yet each step seemed to ripple subtle discomfort through those who noticed her presence. Near the entrance to the main hall stood Jonathan Carlyle, the evening's music director, a man whose reputation was built as much on precision as it was on exclusivity. His sharp navy suit fit him flawlessly, his silver hair combed neatly as he reviewed the final details of the program. When his eyes landed on Sister Margaret, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. A pause, a quiet calculation, then the faintest tightening of his lips. He approached her with practiced politeness, the kind that masked judgment beneath professionalism. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "this is a private performance. Guests and performers only." "Sister." Margaret looked at him, her eyes steady, neither defensive nor apologetic. "I understand," she replied softly. "I was told there might be a piano available." For a brief moment, something unreadable flickered across his face, then it disappeared behind a courteous smile that did not reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said, gesturing subtly toward the grand doors beyond. "This evening is carefully curated. Every performer has been selected well in advance." A nearby couple exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Another guest let out a faint, amused breath, quickly hidden behind a champagne glass. Sister Margaret nodded gently, as if she had expected nothing more. "Of course," she said. No protest, no argument, just acceptance that seemed almost out of place in a moment designed to diminish her. Jonathan gave a short nod, already turning his attention back to more important matters, his focus returning to the performers he believed worthy of the stage. But as she stepped aside, remaining quietly near the edge of the hall, something lingered in the air. Not tension exactly, but a subtle shift, like the first hint of a note before a symphony begins. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, and the doors to the main auditorium opened, inviting guests into rows of velvet seats facing a grand piano that gleamed under a single spotlight. No one noticed the way Sister Margaret's gaze rested on that instrument, calm and unwavering. No one understood that behind her quiet presence was not uncertainty, but patience. And patience, when misunderstood, has a way of rewriting everything. The room filled, the lights dimmed, and somewhere in the hush before the performance began, fate quietly rearranged the evening in ways no one in that hall could yet comprehend. The first piece of the evening began with precision and polish, each note delivered exactly as expected, and yet something about it felt rehearsed in a way that never quite reached the heart of the room. Applause followed, respectful but measured, the kind given out of obligation rather than genuine awe. Jonathan Carlyle stood near the wings, arms crossed, nodding faintly as each performer took their turn, his attention sharp but his satisfaction restrained. This was how the evening was supposed to unfold, controlled, predictable, flawless. Backstage, however, the rhythm of certainty began to fracture. A young pianist, scheduled for the headline performance, sat pale beneath the bright dressing room lights, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the sheet music in front of him. His breathing was uneven, shallow, as though the weight of expectation had settled too heavily on his chest. A stage assistant leaned in, whispering urgently, but the young man only shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I cannot do it," he said, the words falling apart as soon as they left his lips. The assistant's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face as she rushed to find Jonathan. Moments later, the director entered, his composed demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the tension beneath. "You have trained for this," he said, his voice firm but edged with urgency. "The audience is waiting." The pianist swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the keys as if they were something unfamiliar, something impossible. "I cannot feel it," he admitted quietly. "If I go out there like this, I will fail." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant echo of applause from the auditorium. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind racing through options that were rapidly disappearing. Canceling was not acceptable. Replacing him was not possible. The program had been advertised for weeks, the donors seated, the expectations set. Outside, the audience shifted in their seats as a subtle delay stretched longer than anticipated. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, a low current of curiosity turning into unease. In the dim glow of the auditorium, Sister Margaret remained seated near the back, her presence still overlooked, her gaze quietly attentive. She watched as an assistant hurried across the stage, whispering to another, their movements sharp with concern. The spotlight remained fixed on the empty piano, its polished surface reflecting the absence of certainty. Time slowed in that space between expectation and interruption. Jonathan stepped back into the corridor, his expression tightening as he issued quiet instructions that carried the weight of urgency. "We need a solution," he said, his voice low but firm. "Now." The staff exchanged uncertain glances, none willing to suggest the obvious truth that there was no immediate replacement, no hidden performer waiting in the wings. And then, almost as an afterthought, one of the younger assistants hesitated before speaking. "There is someone," she said carefully, her voice unsure. Jonathan turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" She gestured subtly toward the auditorium, toward the place where Sister Margaret sat quietly, unnoticed by most. "The woman from earlier," she added, almost apologetically. A faint, disbelieving exhale escaped him, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, but something close. For a moment, he said nothing, the idea lingering in the air as something both absurd and strangely convenient. The hallway seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And in that fragile pause, between pride and necessity, a decision began to take shape that would soon change everything. Jonathan Carlyle stood still for a moment longer than necessary, the suggestion settling into his mind like something he did not want to examine too closely. The idea was inconvenient, almost insulting to the standard he had spent years building, yet the silence stretching from the auditorium pressed against him with growing urgency. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and adjusted his cuff, a small gesture of control before making a decision that felt anything but controlled. "Bring her," he said quietly. The assistant hesitated, as if unsure whether she had heard correctly, but the firmness in his tone left no room for doubt. She nodded quickly and moved toward the auditorium. Inside, the audience had grown restless, their murmurs weaving through the dim light like a rising tide. A man in the third row checked his watch, another leaned over to whisper to his companion, and somewhere near the front, a woman let out a soft sigh of impatience. The stage remained empty, the grand piano still waiting beneath the spotlight, its silence now heavier than any note it could produce. Sister Margaret sat exactly where she had been, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady on the stage as if she were simply observing, not waiting. When the assistant approached her, there was a brief flicker of uncertainty in the young woman's expression, as though she could not quite reconcile the simplicity of the nun with the gravity of what she was about to ask. "Ma'am," she began softly, leaning down so her voice would not carry. "We have a situation. Would you be willing to play?" For a moment, the words seemed to hang between them, fragile and improbable. Sister Margaret looked up, her expression unchanged, her eyes clear and composed. "If it would help," she replied gently. There was no hesitation, no surprise, only a quiet acceptance that made the request feel less like a favor and more like something inevitable. The assistant swallowed, nodding quickly. "Please come with me." As Sister Margaret stood, a few nearby guests noticed the movement, their attention drawn by curiosity rather than expectation. Whispers followed her as she walked down the aisle, not loud enough to disrupt the room, but present enough to mark her passage. "Is she part of the program?" someone murmured. "She cannot be," another replied under their breath. The murmurs grew softer as she approached the stage, as though even speculation was uncertain in the face of something that did not fit the narrative. Backstage, Jonathan watched her approach, his expression carefully neutral, though a faint tension lingered in the set of his jaw. Up close, her presence was even more unassuming, her movements deliberate but unhurried, her demeanor untouched by the pressure that seemed to fill every corner of the building. He studied her for a brief moment, searching perhaps for some indication that this decision was justified, that there was something beneath the surface that would make sense of what he was about to allow. He found nothing that met his expectations. "You understand," he said, his voice measured. "This is not a rehearsal space. This is a professional performance." Sister Margaret met his gaze without resistance. "I understand," she said. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, then stepped aside with a small, almost dismissive gesture toward the stage. "Very well. We will keep this brief." The words carried a subtle edge, a quiet attempt to maintain authority over a situation that had already slipped beyond his control. The stage manager gave a signal, and the lights shifted slightly, drawing the audience's attention back to the piano. A figure stepped into the spotlight, and for a moment, confusion rippled through the room. This was not the performer they had expected. This was not anyone they recognized. The whispers returned, sharper now, tinged with disbelief. Sister Margaret walked toward the piano, her steps steady, her gaze fixed ahead, unaffected by the weight of 100 curious eyes. She reached the bench and paused for just a fraction of a second, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood as though greeting something familiar. Behind her, Jonathan folded his arms again, his posture rigid, his expression guarded. He had made his decision, but doubt lingered like a shadow he could not quite shake. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes not from anticipation, but from uncertainty. And in that fragile silence, just before anything began, the distance between expectation and reality stretched to its breaking point. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Sister Margaret remained seated at the piano bench, her back straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. The audience watched, uncertain, their earlier whispers fading into a cautious silence that carried more doubt than respect. A man in the front row leaned back slightly, crossing his arms with a faint, skeptical smile, while another guest tilted her head, as if trying to understand how this quiet, elderly nun had found her way onto such a stage. Behind the curtain, Jonathan Carlyle's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression controlled, but his patience already thinning. In his mind, this was a temporary solution, a moment to fill the gap before the program could regain its structure. He expected hesitation, perhaps even failure, something that would justify his earlier judgment. But what he did not expect was stillness. Not the kind born from uncertainty, but the kind that settles before something deliberate begins. Sister Margaret slowly lifted her hands and placed them on the keys, her fingers resting there without pressing down, as though reacquainting themselves with something deeply familiar. The gesture was simple, almost unremarkable, yet it carried a quiet authority that did not ask for attention, but naturally commanded it. The room seemed to respond without realizing it, conversations ceasing entirely, the air itself holding steady as if waiting. Then, with no announcement, no dramatic gesture, the first note sounded. It was soft, almost fragile, but perfectly clear, resonating through the hall with a purity that cut through every lingering doubt. A few heads lifted, curiosity replacing skepticism, as the sound lingered just long enough to be felt before it faded into the next. The second note followed, then the third, each one building not in volume, but in intention. There was no rush, no attempt to impress, only a quiet unfolding that drew the audience in before they had time to resist. Within seconds, The melody began to take shape, and with it came something unexpected, something that did not belong to rehearsed performances or practiced precision alone. It carried memory. It carried depth. The kind of depth that could not be taught in classrooms or perfected in competitions. In the third row, the man who had crossed his arms slowly leaned forward, his expression shifting as realization began to replace doubt. A woman near the aisle brought her hand to her chest without noticing, her eyes fixed on the stage as if afraid to miss even a single note. The transformation in the room was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it spread quickly, like a quiet understanding passing from one person to another. Backstage, Jonathan's posture changed almost without his consent. His arms loosened, his head tilting slightly as his focus sharpened. This was not what he had expected. The technique alone was enough to command respect, every movement precise, every transition seamless, but it was the emotion beneath it that unsettled him. This was not performance for recognition. This was something else entirely. Sister Margaret's hands moved with a confidence that did not seek approval, her fingers gliding across the keys with an ease that suggested years, decades even, of experience hidden beneath her quiet exterior. The music grew stronger, not louder in a way that overwhelmed, but fuller, richer, filling the space in a way that left no room for distraction. The audience was no longer observing. They were listening, truly listening. The room had gone completely still now, the earlier tension replaced by something far deeper, something that held every person in place without effort. Even those who had doubted the most found themselves unable to look away. And as the melody continued to rise, carrying with it a quiet power that could not be denied, one truth began to settle into the room with undeniable clarity. They had not been given a replacement performance. They had been given something far rarer. And for the first time that evening, no one dared to interrupt. The melody did not rush toward its conclusion, nor did it seek to overwhelm the audience with complexity alone. Instead, it unfolded with a quiet confidence that seemed to stretch time itself, each note placed with intention, each phrase carrying a weight that could be felt even by those who did not understand the language of music. Sister Margaret's hands moved with increasing fluidity, her fingers no longer simply pressing keys, but shaping something alive, something that rose and fell like a breath shared by the entire room. The grand piano responded as though it had been waiting for her, its voice fuller now, resonating through the hall with a depth that settled into the chest and refused to be ignored. In the front rows, expressions began to change in ways that could not be hidden. The man who had once leaned back with skepticism now sat forward completely, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her hands as if searching for proof of what he was hearing. A woman who had earlier whispered doubt now sat motionless, her lips slightly parted, her attention captured in a way she could not explain. Even those who had arrived expecting an evening of predictable excellence now found themselves confronted with something they had not anticipated, something that could not be measured by reputation or credentials. Backstage, Jonathan Carlyle no longer stood with the composed distance of a director overseeing a program. His posture had shifted entirely, his arms lowered at his sides, his focus sharpened to a single point as he watched the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier. The certainty that had guided his decisions began to unravel quietly, replaced by a growing realization that did not announce itself, but settled heavily in his thoughts. This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was mastery, the kind that could not be staged or imitated. Sister Margaret's expression remained unchanged, her face calm, her eyes steady, as though she were not performing for an audience at all, but simply allowing something long held within her to finally be heard. The music swelled, not in chaos, but in clarity, each passage building upon the last with a precision that spoke of discipline, while the emotion beneath it carried something far deeper, something that reached beyond technique into memory, into experience, into a lifetime that no one in that room had taken the time to imagine. The sound filled every corner of the theater, rising into the balconies, echoing softly against the walls, until there was no space left untouched by it. The audience had fallen completely silent now, not the uncertain silence from before, but one born from complete attention, the kind that leaves no room for distraction, no space for doubt. Somewhere near the back, a man lowered his phone slowly, realizing that capturing the moment would somehow diminish it. Another guest blinked rapidly, as if surprised by the emotion that had found its way into her eyes without permission. And still, Sister Margaret continued, her hands moving with unwavering certainty, her presence grounded in something far beyond the stage itself. As the piece approached its final movement, the tension in the room shifted once more, not toward anticipation of an ending, but toward an understanding that something rare was unfolding, something that could not be repeated or replaced. Jonathan took a single step forward without realizing it, his breath held, his earlier judgment now impossible to reconcile with what he was witnessing. The final sequence began, each note delivered with a quiet intensity that drew the entire room closer, as if the sound itself were guiding them toward a single shared moment. And when the last chord finally rang out, it did not end abruptly, but lingered, its resonance hanging in the air like a question no one was prepared to answer. For a brief second, time seemed to pause, the silence that followed heavier than anything that had come before. And in that silence, the truth settled fully, undeniable and complete, that everything they thought they understood had just been rewritten. For a moment, no one moved. The final note still lingered in the air, its resonance fading slowly into a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, as if the room itself understood that anything spoken too soon would break something fragile and irreplaceable. Sister Margaret's hands remained gently resting on the keys, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though the performance had not been an extraordinary event, but simply a natural continuation of something long practiced in quiet solitude. The audience sat frozen, caught between disbelief and recognition, each person processing the same realization in their own way, that what they had just witnessed could not be dismissed, could not be explained away by coincidence or curiosity. In the front row, the man who had once doubted lowered his gaze briefly, a subtle shift that carried the weight of quiet acknowledgement. Nearby, a woman blinked away the last trace of emotion, her composure returning slowly, though her eyes remained fixed on the figure at the piano, as if trying to hold onto the moment a little longer. Backstage, Jonathan Carlyle did not speak. The confidence that had defined his presence throughout the evening had been replaced by something far more restrained, something closer to reflection than control. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of a truth he could no longer ignore. He had seen talent before, he had built entire programs around it, but this was different. This was not performance shaped by expectation. This was authenticity, undeniable and unfiltered. A single sound broke the silence. It came from somewhere in the middle rows, a pair of hands coming together in a soft, almost hesitant applause. For a brief second, it stood alone, uncertain, as if testing whether it was allowed to exist. Then another joined, and another, until the sound began to build, not explosively, but steadily, rising like a wave that could no longer be held back. Within moments, the entire auditorium was filled with applause, not the polite acknowledgement that had followed earlier performances, but something deeper, something earned. People rose to their feet without being prompted, their expressions no longer guarded, their admiration no longer hidden. The sound echoed against the walls, filling the space with a recognition that words could not fully capture. Sister Margaret slowly lifted her hands from the keys and stood, turning gently to face the audience. She did not bow immediately. Instead, she looked out across the room, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged by the reaction surrounding her. There was no trace of triumph in her expression, no sign that she sought validation from the response she had just received. When she finally inclined her head in a small, respectful gesture, it was simple, almost understated, yet it carried more dignity than any grand acknowledgement could achieve. Jonathan stepped forward from the shadows of the wings, his movements measured, his expression composed but no longer distant. For a brief moment, he hesitated, as if unsure of how to approach a situation that had reversed itself so completely. The authority he had relied on earlier now fell out of place, replaced by something quieter, something more human. When he reached her, he stopped, the distance between them marked not by status, but by understanding. "That was," he began, but the words did not come easily. For someone accustomed to precise language, to clear judgment, This moment resisted simplification. He paused, then spoke again, his voice lower, more deliberate. Extraordinary. Sister Margaret met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm. It was simply music, she replied softly. The simplicity of her answer settled between them, carrying a weight that no elaborate explanation could match. Around them, the applause continued, but for Jonathan, the sound had already begun to fade into something more internal, something reflective. He looked at her, truly looked this time, and for the first time that evening, he saw not what she appeared to be, but what she had always been. And in that quiet realization, the distance between judgment and understanding finally disappeared. The applause did not fade quickly. It continued, steady and sustained, as though the audience was unwilling to let the moment end, as though stopping would somehow diminish what they had just experienced. Some clapped with measured dignity, others with an intensity that betrayed how deeply they had been moved, but all shared the same unspoken understanding that something rare had unfolded before them. Sister Margaret remained still for a moment longer, allowing the sound to exist without reacting to it, her presence grounded, unaffected by the recognition that now surrounded her. When she finally stepped back from the piano, her movements were as quiet and deliberate as when she had first approached it, as though the stage itself did not belong to her, even after she had transformed it. In the front rows, conversations began again, but they were different now, hushed and reflective rather than curious or dismissive. "Who is she?" someone whispered, the question carrying not skepticism but genuine wonder. Another voice responded softly, "I have never heard anything like that." The uncertainty that had once defined their perception had been replaced by something else entirely, something closer to respect, though it arrived quietly, without announcement. Jonathan Carlyle stood beside the piano, his gaze following Sister Margaret as she prepared to leave the stage. The authority he once carried with ease now felt distant, replaced by a weight he had not anticipated. He had built his reputation on recognizing excellence, on curating performances that met the highest standards, and yet tonight, excellence had appeared in a form he had nearly dismissed without a second thought. The realization did not come with embarrassment or visible regret, but it settled into him nonetheless, a quiet shift in perspective that could not be undone. "Sister," he said, his voice measured but no longer guarded. She paused, turning slightly to face him, her expression calm, her attention fully present. For a moment, he seemed to search for the right words, something that would bridge the gap between his earlier judgment and the respect he now felt. "You did not tell us," he finally said, though the statement carried more reflection than accusation. Sister Margaret regarded him gently, her eyes steady. "You did not ask," she replied. There was no sharpness in her tone, no attempt to correct or criticize, only a simple truth delivered without weight. The words lingered between them, settling into the space where assumptions had once lived. Jonathan gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged more than agreement, the kind that marked understanding. Around them, members of the staff began to move again, their earlier urgency replaced by a quiet efficiency, though many glanced towards Sister Margaret as they passed, their expressions softened by something new. One of the assistants who had first approached her stepped forward, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with admiration she could not fully hide. "That was incredible," she said softly, her voice sincere. Sister Margaret offered a small, warm smile, one that did not seek acknowledgement, but returned it. "Thank you," she said. There was no elaboration, no attempt to explain what had just taken place, as though explanation would only reduce it. As she moved toward the side of the stage, a few members of the audience remained standing, their eyes following her with a quiet reverence that had not existed before. No one stopped her, no one rushed forward, but the space around her seemed to open naturally, as if the room itself understood that she did not need to be held there. Jonathan watched her go, his thoughts no longer centered on the program or the schedule, but on the shift that had occurred, not only in the room, but within himself. The evening would continue, the remaining performances would follow, but something fundamental had changed, something that could not be restored to its previous state. And as Sister Margaret stepped away from the stage, returning to the quiet from which she had come, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, that the most extraordinary presence in the room had been the one they had almost turned away. The program resumed, but something had shifted in a way that no schedule could correct. The next performer walked onto the stage with practiced confidence, the kind that had earned applause countless times before. Yet as the first notes began, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The music was precise, technically flawless, but the room did not respond in the same way. The audience listened, but they did not lean forward. They applauded, but the sound felt thinner, less certain, as though something essential had already been given to them, leaving everything else to follow in its shadow. In the upper rows, a man who had attended dozens of such performances sat quietly, his fingers resting against his chin as he replayed the earlier moment in his mind, unable to fully return to the present. A woman beside him shifted in her seat, her gaze drifting back toward the side of the stage where Sister Margaret had disappeared, as if expecting her to return. The memory of that performance lingered in the air, not as nostalgia, but as a quiet standard that had been set without permission. Backstage, the atmosphere had changed just as profoundly. Conversations were softer now, movements more deliberate, as if everyone had become aware of something they had previously overlooked. The assistant who had first approached Sister Margaret stood near the corridor, watching the stage through a narrow opening, her expression thoughtful. "Who was she?" another staff member asked in a low voice. The assistant hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "I do not think we ever really knew," she replied. The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that lingered beyond the words themselves. Jonathan Carlyle remained near the wings, though he was no longer directing with the same intensity. His attention drifted between the stage and the hallway beyond, where Sister Margaret had quietly exited. The program continued as planned, yet his focus had shifted entirely, drawn not to what was happening in front of him, but to what had already passed. The certainty that once defined his decisions now felt incomplete, as though it had been built on assumptions that no longer held their ground. After the final performance concluded, the audience rose once more, offering applause that was respectful and deserved, yet different in tone, lacking the depth that had filled the room earlier. Guests began to gather their belongings, conversations resuming with renewed energy, but their words circled back to the same question, again and again. "That nun," someone said, shaking their head in quiet disbelief. "I have never seen anything like it." Another voice added, "It was not just skill, it was something else." The descriptions varied, but the conclusion remained the same, that what they had witnessed could not be categorized or easily explained. Jonathan stepped out into the lobby, the warm lights reflecting once more across the polished marble floors, though now they seemed less imposing, less significant. He scanned the room instinctively, searching for a familiar figure that did not stand out, a presence that blended too easily into the background. For a brief moment, he thought he saw her near the entrance, moving quietly among the departing guests, her gray habit barely noticeable against the flow of people. He took a step forward, then another, his pace quickening slightly, but by the time he reached the doorway, she was gone. The street outside stretched into the night, the distant hum of traffic replacing the echo of music, the world continuing as it always did, unchanged and unaware. He stood there for a moment, the cool air brushing against his face, the weight of realization settling deeper with each passing second. There had been no introduction, no announcement, no recognition prepared for her arrival or her departure. She had come quietly, left quietly, and yet the space she filled remained impossible to ignore. Behind him, the doors closed softly, the final sounds of the evening fading into memory. And somewhere beyond the reach of that grand hall, the woman they had nearly dismissed carried nothing with her except the same quiet dignity she had arrived with, leaving behind a room full of people who would not forget what they had failed to see. The night carried on beyond the theater, but for those who had been inside, something had shifted in a way that followed them into the quiet streets and into their thoughts long after the final applause had faded. Jonathan Carlyle remained standing just inside the entrance for a while longer, his reflection faintly visible in the glass doors, his posture still, but his mind anything but. The world outside moved as it always did, cars passing, distant voices blending into the rhythm of the city, yet for him, the evening had not ended. It lingered, not in the program he had so carefully constructed, but in the single moment that had defied every expectation he had trusted for years. He replayed it again, not the applause, not the reaction, but the beginning, the quiet way she had placed her hands on the keys without seeking permission from the room, without asking to be believed. And he understood something then that he had not allowed himself to consider before, that true mastery does not announce itself, does not negotiate its place. It simply exists, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. The following morning, the theater returned to its usual routine, staff moving through the halls with practiced efficiency, conversations returning to schedules and upcoming performances, but the tone had changed, subtle but unmistakable. The assistant who had first approached Sister Margaret found herself pausing more often, noticing details she might have overlooked before, questioning assumptions that had once felt automatic. Others did the same, though none spoke of it directly. It was not something easily explained, but it was there, in the way they looked at one another, in the way they listened more carefully, in the way silence carried a little more meaning than it had before. Jonathan walked through the empty auditorium that morning, the rows of seats now still, the grand piano resting under soft natural light streaming through high windows. Without the presence of an audience, the space felt different, less imposing, more honest. He approached the piano slowly, his hand resting briefly on its polished surface, the same place where Sister Margaret's fingers had begun the transformation of the entire evening. For a moment, he said nothing, did nothing, simply standing there as if acknowledging something he could not fully articulate. Later that day, a small envelope arrived at the front desk, unmarked except for a simple handwritten note inside. It contained no grand explanation, no detailed history, only a few words written in steady, careful script. Thank you for allowing the music to be heard. There was no signature beyond a single initial, no return address, nothing that demanded recognition or invited further inquiry. Jonathan held the note in his hand for a long moment, reading it more than once, as though searching for something hidden between the lines. But there was nothing hidden, only the same quiet clarity that had defined her presence from the beginning. He placed the note gently on his desk, not as a reminder of a mistake, but as a marker of something learned, something earned in a way he had not expected. In the weeks that followed, the story spread in quiet circles, shared not through headlines or announcements, but through conversations, through the kind of retelling that carried more feeling than detail. Each person who spoke of it described something slightly different, yet the essence remained unchanged. A woman no one recognized, a performance no one could forget, and a moment that revealed more about the audience than the performer. Back in the quiet of the convent, far removed from chandeliers and marble floors, Sister Margaret returned to her routine as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The piano there was older, its keys worn from years of gentle use. Its sound softer, less grand, but no less true. She sat before it in the early morning light, her hands resting once again on the familiar keys, her expression the same as it had always been. There was no audience, no applause, no expectation, only the music itself, unfolding as it always had, patient and steady. And in that quiet space, untouched by judgment or recognition, the same truth remained, simple and unwavering, that dignity does not need to be proven to be real, it only needs to be seen. And that night, in a room full of certainty, it finally was.